are, by that clock it's 8:30. We're trying to figure out who's going to be brave enough to try to change the clock again and not drop it and break it like some of us have done before. Just me and Ricky's the only two that's done that. And I was special in that I nearly took out Brenda when I knocked it off, so Ricky was smarter and knocked it down when nobody was under it. So, but nonetheless, we're certainly thankful for your being here. We are always excited to be able to come together on a beautiful day like today. Got up this morning and turned the television on real quick. And of course, after watching 3 sermons, I feel like I've already been to services at least for an hour and a half, it seems as though. And that encouragement, of course, is always highly beneficial and a reason for us to get up on a beautiful day like this. If you need motivation to get up on a day like today, then you're in a heap of trouble, mentally or physically one, because it is a beautiful day out there, and we look forward to enjoying it and seeking to use it to bring honor and glory unto God through our efforts today in worshiping the only true and living God in a manner we trust is acceptable unto Him. We're going to be the consensus of everybody that expressed their desires as to where we're going to be studying. And I stipulated, just of course as a stipulation relative to a place for us to start studying, would be somewhere in the midst of the history of Israel. And of course we made note of the fact that after you get to the book of Joshua and you got the children of Israel that are in the land of Canaan, fixing to do a whooping on all the inhabitants of the land, just as God has designed for it to happen, that history will continue all the way through the book of Esther. And so that whole time frame with the various prophets finding their place, both minor and major prophets, in that time frame, so we got wide open as to where we could go. And it was a unanimous decision that we study in Joshua. And by that I mean nobody said anything, and so I decided Joshua. Okay. So as you, all it took had been one person to admit a tie, and then we had to flip a coin or something, I guess. And I went back and forth from Joshua to Nehemiah to Ezra and finally I said, okay, we'll just start with the history of Israel. And it's been quite some time that we even studied. I know one time I put together lessons on the book of Joshua, and it was one of those things where once you get started, it was hard to leave Joshua because there's so many principles that are found in the book of Joshua that are certainly applicable to us today, even though we don't live under the law of Moses, obviously. But there are so many principles as to the nature of God and the character of mankind that you can see it reading almost like a newspaper in modern day America, some of the problems and some of the failings and some of the successes that were enjoyed by the children of Israel during that period of time. They just fit the bill of what we see in our world today. There's always going to be the need for direction from God, and that's the case in Joshua, and how prominent the role of God's Word is the directing agent for all that Joshua is going to do. And a tremendous change has taken place because here they've had a great hero and a man who stood head and shoulders above the rest, although he was reluctant to become the leader of the children of Israel to begin with. And of course, that's Moses. How would you like to take Moses' place? You know, how would you like to be the person that after Moses has gone through all that he's done, all the intercession that he's made in behalf of the people before God, go so far as to say, instead of killing all these Israelites that are out here now in the wilderness, then go ahead and take me and let them alone. Now, that's a pretty prominent position for a person to take, and yet that's exactly the attitude that was expressed by Moses, which of course is impossible. That's not the way it works. What would be the death of a mere man, even though he's a great man? You know, it took the sacrifice of the Son of God himself in order to pay for the sins of mankind, and a mere man, even though a good man would be willing to do that, it's not going to come about. And of course, the same thing was expressed too by Paul in the New Testament. He made that same statement relative to his Jewish brethren, which of course again is an impossibility, but it shows the love that he had for the people. And the love that he had for the people caused him to act. Did we give them all of them out?
Yeah, we did.
Oh, wow.
I'll copy
So we got quite a few more in here than I anticipated. So that's the purpose for our study here. And as we go throughout this book, of course, we'll make specific references as there are obviously questions, and we'll make some present-day application of the principles that we run upon. And of course, that's exactly what God expects us to do. It's not simply to be able to memorize the whole Bible. You know, if a person memorized the Bible from the very beginning to the very end, then until he takes application of that which he's heard, then he's going to be terribly, terribly lacking. And so we want to do more than just know the facts. We want to be able to, based upon the facts, draw the conclusions that are made necessary by the evidence. And as a matter of fact, that's a principle that has been overlooked, sadly, when it comes to reasoning and rationality and logic, is that we live in a day and an age now in which just the willingness of individuals to sit down and talk about things that they differ on is almost impossible, because people are not willing to have tested what they believe and what they do. They're going to dig their heels in when they don't have no rationality, no truth to support it. They're still going to dig in and say, this is where I'm standing and I'm not going any further. And you call a person like that in the world in general crazy, because they deny the very truth that exists in whatever area you are. I mean, it doesn't matter how many people hate algebra, the rules of algebra still apply. It doesn't matter how many people despise the field of trigonometry. If it were not for trigonometry, then we'd be in a whole lot worse shape than we are right now, because the need to use such tools as that are based upon the truth of mathematics in order to get by well. Well, even more so, obviously, the truth of the Bible. How would you classify this particular book? Which we've already mentioned, but what would you say it is? It's a book of what? A book of history. It's not a book of poetry. It's not a book of prophecy. It's a book of history. And some people really do like history of all kinds. Some people hate history of all kinds. But I'm convinced that if people do not like history, it's very likely that they did not ever have any good history teachers. Because I'm convinced that a good history teacher will cause a person to appreciate history. And maybe that was a different era in which history held a more prominent role. I mean, I know the history teachers that I had were not, and I'm not going to throw off on football coaches in totality here, but sadly it got to the point where if you couldn't find anybody else to teach history, or couldn't find anybody else to teach civics, or anybody else to teach some of these subjects like that really were just to fill the day, then you gave it to a coach. You know? And sometimes the coach was studious in his preparation for the class, but then at other times, you know, it was just read the book and go along. Well, that's not any good. And so to give an individual something to do, sometimes those classes were given to people who were not really wanting to be in there to begin with, and so people's understanding of history suffered. And today then, when a person doesn't know anything about history, when somebody comes along and says something that is supposed to be of historical significance, many people do not have a clue as to what has been said is true or not. It's because somebody's saying something happened in the past, and you know, since I didn't live back then maybe what they said is true. But is there an accurate historical record? Well, obviously we know that the story's been told down through the years that it's the winners that write the history, you know. So if you're going to find out about World War II, then if you were wanting to get to the truth of the matter, then maybe, just maybe, you would not view it from the standpoint of somebody who's going to leave out all the bad and ugly stuff, even though the bad and ugly stuff took place. But one thing that we have with the Bible is that all the bad and ugly stuff is there. And if it was left up to man, he wouldn't include that. The heroes of the Bible would not have done anything bad if mankind was writing about the heroes of the Bible. But yet, God includes all of it. So it could not be a book that was of human ingenuity. It had to come from a holy, holy, holy God. That's exactly what we have in this historical book. What some have referred to the book of Joshua as being the capstone to the Pentateuch, to Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That is, it brings to a conclusion and puts a cap on what has transpired before, and then it sets the tone for everything that's going to come after it. And if you just, of course, you can do this just about any book that is obviously historical, but if you take the book of Joshua out of the Bible, then you're going to be confused throughout the rest of the Old Testament, because stuff just will not make much sense. Well, how did them children of Israel get over there in the land of Canaan? How did all that come about? And one of the things that has been used as a supposed slight against God, and even a question as to whether a holy God would demand the things that we read about him demanding in the book of Joshua, is that mankind, sadly, wants to look at things through his own preconceived ideas and not look at things through the eyes of the God who created mankind to begin with and made determinations at various times down through history that man had messed up so severely and had gone so far in his rebellion against God that he no longer deserved to live. And what event had taken place prior, a long time prior to the book of Joshua, in which that was demonstrated? The flood, the building of the ark. When every imagination of man's heart was only evil continually, God says, I shouldn't even create these people. And so there was one man and his family that were saved from the flood. But the position and the picture there painted is that those people were so depraved, there were no redeeming qualities in them. Now, can we say with the same certainty that God analyzed here that people are past the point of no return? Can we look at something in the situation that prevails and say, well, as a whole, there is no way that anybody in that whole group could ever be rightly brought back to a reasonable and rational concept of God and his will? Well, we can't really do that. We can't see into people's hearts and minds. And what we have, sadly, today in our society is an evidence that increasingly causes us to ask, is there any common ground? And if there is a common ground, what is it? I mean, what is the in-between? What is the common ground between murdering a child right up to the moment that he's born to being pro-life, and when a child is conceived, that life is precious in the sight of God and deserving of being protected? Where's the middle ground in that? Well, there is none. There's no middle ground. The happenings in our world today has resulted in these colossal rejections of the value of human life and gone to the extreme where rejoicing is common, that people can kill more babies. They're so happy. It's such a great, wonderful thing. All right, we've got a city now, and we'll even help pay for you to come to our state from another state if you're seeking to kill your child. Abortion, traveling, and paid for. And don't be surprised if your own tax money don't end up being used to pay for it too, because it already is Planned Parenthood. So there is no in-between. And what is the in-between between saying that there are two sexes, two genders, and they same thing, male and female, and that there is a multiplicity of genders? So far it stops at 128, but who knows, by the end of the day it'll probably be 130. And that a baby at 2 or 3 years old can know that he's in the wrong body, and thus puberty blockers and all other things need to be shot into that child so that they can start the transition to a different sex. What's the common ground between that barbaric, inhumane practice and saying, no, you're either a boy or a girl? Is there a middle ground? Well, there is no middle ground. What is the middle ground? And so it seems increasingly that that the people who have the loudest bullhorn and are causing the most disruption and are resulting in the most loss of life are those who are on this far right, far left fringe. This is right, far left fringe, seeking to demand that we accept and promote whatever they say is supposed to be accepted and promoted. And if we don't, then that's when all the designations for us result. You know, we're racist, homophobes, you name it. We're all those things, and it is the direct result of there being no middle ground. By the time that the children of Israel go into the land of Canaan, there's no middle ground with the Canaanites. You know, the simple message that we'll see is if these people cannot be converted and they will not leave on their own, they are made to leave or they die. Now, who has the capacity to know that the time has come for that to happen? God does. And the last time I noticed, God has not been calling any human being and asking them for advice. He don't need to, because he knows it all too well.
The Bible says, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord.
Exactly. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. And obviously he placed in motion in the civil government that justice was to prevail even in civil government, because civil government is a minister to thee for good if you do well. Now, sadly, there again we have almost a no middle ground position, even in regards to that, when the government is promoting the things that are to the far left and acting as if you don't go along with that, then you're going to be penalized and treated in some type of way. So we have to realize that the problems that existed, many of the same difficulties that had to be dealt with in the days of the Canaanites and Joshua and the children of Israel, are the same type of things today. One of the particular specific means of worship of the Canaanites was the slaughter of children and illicit sexual activity, supposedly in promotion of the worship of their deities, which reads like today. Sometimes you might ask, of course they had their various gods, Molech and others, and that's exactly what we have in our day, which they would claim would be a rejection of religion, and yet what they're doing is in fact a religion. It has all the tenets of religion. They are zealously in promotion of the religion, whether it's transgenderism, whether it's a Green New Deal, it's a religion. And you simply are not allowed to have a difference of opinion. You're simply not allowed to even present your information that would provide a blow to the head of those who are trying to promote this particular religion. And when you have so many people intertwined in promoting this, and you're on the receiving end of the bad results of that, then you can see that far from that being, this example being Old Testament, doesn't have anything to do with us today, it's exactly the same thing today as it was then. There's a clear right and a clear wrong. There's things that should be done, and there's things that are an anathema to do. And when those things get mixed up, which is what's on the front page of the newspaper every day, then we're in a heap of trouble. And we are. And, but, in spite of that, I'm going to quit preaching my sermon because I got to do that here in a few minutes. All right. My poor Bible. Look at that. It's too big. And glue don't work, I'll just tell you. All right, as we stated, the book of Joshua is a stepping stone from what has transpired previously, and now the children of Israel being given a land. Up to this moment in time, they don't have a land, but they're going to be given a land, and this land is the land that was promised all the way back to Abraham, and of course not to him specifically, but to his descendants, all the way back to the end of Genesis chapter 11 and the first few verses of Genesis chapter 12. And so that's coming to pass here. The giving of the land and the specifics of the boundaries of the land are all specified as well. It's been about 40 years by this time that Joshua has been serving as Moses' minister. What does that mean? What is it if he's his minister? What is he? He's second in command. He's his servant. He's his associate, assistant. That's what he is. And so here's a fellow who's not just chosen off the street. Oh, there looks like a good general. No, he's got a military background already. He's already been involved in fighting and leading the forces of the Canaanites against the inhabitants of the land before they even get to Canaan. So he's only the proper person who, by way of experience, he is prepared for this position to lead the armies of God. And so he also is, if you remember, he's also one of the 12 what that were sent into the land of Canaan. One of the 12 spies. And of course, of those 12 spies, how many of them worth anything? Only 2, and Joshua was one, and Caleb was the other, okay? So Joshua he's a man that's well known, he knows what he's doing, but again, keep in mind that when we think about these military exploits, whether it be something amazing like we have the nation of Israel here and all the battles that are going to be following the direction that God gives throughout the book of Joshua. Or you have examples like Gideon and his 300. Start off with 32,000, ends up with 300 people. The point throughout all that, and it's oftentimes included in the text, is not because that these people of God could do more sit-ups than the enemies, or they were better marksmen than the enemies, or they had gone through a more extensive training than their enemies, or they were taller, or they had more muscle mass. What was the distinguishing characteristic of these armies? They were God's. They were God's people. Now, does that mean that these soldiers did not have to be concerned about being fit enough to participate in battle? No, they still had to do everything that was within their power to be the best they could be on the field of battle. But the battle is not going to be won by their strategic abilities and their great prowess and no. But here's what's amazing, is that when you realize, as some of them did, not near enough did, when you realize that God is in fact your commander-in-chief, then you get real courageous. You don't fear your enemy, because you know that in reality that's not really your enemy. That's God's enemy. And if God's the general and he's against these people, and I'm with God who's against these people, then whatever happens, we can be successful. If God wants something done, it needs to be done, and I to the best of my ability, can do what God wants me to do. And hopefully that little pep talk there was given to them at times. You know, oh, it looks like we're going to be killed. You know, and later on, you know, all these, the Israelite army sitting there, oh, look at this giant, oh, Goliath, oh, he's so big, he'll kill us, he'll mash us like a worm. And little old David, because he went to West Point, he didn't go to West Point, because he had read military books and the art of war. He'd read the art of war and he'd learned all about, no, that's not right. He just knew the difference between God and the Philistine heathen God. He knew the difference between right and wrong. He knew that this uncircumcised Philistine was blaspheming the armies of the living God. And he said, who's going to shut this guy up? And here's all his brothers older than him and fighting in the army, taller, stronger. But they weren't doing anything. Maybe they hadn't received that pep talk. Listen, if we're fighting against this army, and this army that we're fighting against because God said for us to fight against them and defeat them because they're wicked people and they deserve to be destroyed, then couldn't we get excited over here and do what God wants us to do? Instead of running around, oh, we're going to be killed, you know. Which is exactly the attitude of the 10 faithless spies when the 12 were sent into the... We look like grasshoppers. They look at us. Y'all ain't nothing but a bunch of little puny grasshoppers. They'll kill us if we go over there. And so all the way back then, 40 years previous, more than 40 years previous, Joshua says, and Caleb says, no, we are well able to take the land. And he didn't say that because he said, I got this secret strategy. Now, the strategies that are used, and we're going to look at some of the strategies which are brilliant, obviously, as to how they do take some of these cities, then that's not the reason why they're successful. They're successful because they're God's army. And Joshua simply serves as the leader of that army. So he's a minister or a servant of God. He possesses great faith. If there ever was a person who had been provided for, who'd been taught, who'd been by the right-hand man of Moses and learning the ins and outs of the people and learning from the good that Moses did and also learning from the mistakes that Moses made. And how's that supposed to work, you know? If you see a position that Moses takes and how he goes about doing something and it's successful and God approves of it, then, hey, that's something that I need to do. But at the same time, if you see Moses do something in which he's reprimanded by God and even told you're not going to go into the land of Canaan, then maybe you need to shy away from doing that, which is pretty common sense, isn't it? You know, it's sort of like, you know, Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. And that's the principle. Somebody is watching us. And of course, sometimes we limit that to, well, our kid says. Well, there's more than just our kid says. There's a lot of people watching us. What do they see? What are they thinking as they observe what we do? What are people in the community thinking as they observe and hear what we do? At the store, wherever it is, what are people thinking when they see us? Or is this just another one of those people that claims to believe in God, but there really is no distinction between the world and the way they live? Or is there a genuine distinction between the life they're living and what some that claim to be living for the Lord actually do? People know that. And a person who's good at observing can learn from that. Don't do what gets you in trouble with God. Do what gets you on the right side of God. Pretty simple. Pretty simple for sure. And, of course, if you apply the principle from 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 21, prove all things, hold fast that which is good, then don't do something until you can prove that it's what you ought to be doing. And then, when somebody follows you, then you say, here's the reason why I did that. Here's the reason why I said that. Here's the reason why I didn't do that. Here's the reason why I didn't say that. And your source is always the very Word of God. So the position that Joshua is going to take is not always going to be the popular position to take. Whenever Moses would take a position that was in harmony with God's will and the people didn't like it, there's always the possibility that the pressure of acceptance overrides the principle that God has given. They're not going to like me if I say this. They're not going to appreciate my demonstration of concern for their spiritual well-being here. Do I bite my lip when my mouth ought to be talking? Do I keep on talking when I ought to bite my lip? You know, those are real, live, day in, day out decisions have to be made. And what is the basis upon which we make those decisions? You know, to be silent when you're supposed to be talking is wrong, but to be talking when you ought to be silent is wrong too. And don't say, well, I can't figure out which one. Well, you can too. It might take a little while, but you can figure out whether it's the right thing to do or not, for sure. Here's a quotation. The purpose of the book of Joshua is to provide an official and authoritative account of God's faithfulness in leading his people into the promised land. It is an important link in the chain of God's plan of salvation for man. Now, as we mentioned last Sunday morning or Wednesday night, last Sunday morning, every book in the Bible has a purpose. And taking a book out of its context sometimes causes us to not recognize the purpose. I mean, if you just pick the book of Leviticus and you start reading the book of Leviticus and you don't consider the context, don't consider why it's there or anything, then you're going to be real confused and say, why am I reading this? What is all this instruction relative to what you wear? You got to be kidding me. And specific colors but without it, then we would not understand the restrictions and the specific requirements that God placed upon the Levites. And so it was highly informative, beneficial, and necessary for them, and for us to recognize that as the priesthood of God for the children of Israel, there are many comparisons that certainly can and should be made relative to the priesthood of God today, which happens to be who? All of us, every child of God. We're a priest. Now, the specifics, obviously, do not have application, but the principles do. Here's a distinctive characteristics that are possessed by those who are mediators for God with their fellow man. Now, in a professional, from a professional standpoint, but as brothers and sisters in Christ and as concerned human beings, then those characteristics that set the Levites apart from the rest should be characteristics that set us apart from the rest of the world as well. Concerning the right of conquest, I want to read this and I want you to see if you agree with this or not. That Israel was to have a land of her own is the clear teaching of Scripture. Over 500 years before the Exodus, the Lord promised Abraham that after a period of affliction, his seed would be freed and have great possessions. Of course, we studied that in Genesis chapter 15. It would transpire when the iniquity of the Amorites is full, but it wasn't yet full then. In addition to this, they would be given the land between the river of Egypt and the river Euphrates, Genesis 15, verse 18. Later, special instruction was given to Moses regarding the conquest and settlement of the land, Deuteronomy chapter 7 and then Deuteronomy chapter 20. We should keep in mind that the instruction to conquer Canaan was not human but divine. Therefore, it serves as a commentary on God's holiness and his judgment of sin. This destruction of the cities of Canaan with their inhabitants was not merely to give Israel military control of the area, But it was, in effect, a judgment of God upon the wickedness of the land. Now, that's just another way of saying what they got, they deserved. And we are not in a position to question God. Now, from a practical standpoint, you think about this from 2020 hindsight, obviously. Well, what about the children? What about the innocent people? If those innocent children had been able to grow up in that culture, they would have become just as depraved without proper influence as their parents were. Therefore, they were being given a reprieve in that they were killed so that they did not suffer the consequences that the older accountable people faced because of their wickedness. They were pure and clean if they were innocent, and thus they will not end up eternally in hell. But the parents, yeah. So it was for the even the good of the innocent. I mean, when you look at when God told Saul to destroy the Amalekites, and of course it wasn't just that. The Amalekites had not allowed them safe passage when they were traveling back here during this wilderness wandering. That was one of the things, but their iniquity was also to the brim, and thus even the animals died. What did the poor animals do? Well, it was the wrong place, wrong time. They suffered the consequences right along with everybody else. Now, keep in mind that oftentimes when you defeat an enemy, back during this period of time, and specific instruction was even given regarding this, is that there was such a thing called spoil. And sometimes it's called booty. And when I say that, the grandkids say, oh, you said a better word. I said, no, it's not that kind. It's a different kind. And so you kill all the animals and you bring them home and eat them and throw them in your freezer. And you're doing God's bidding. And it's getting rid of the stench of ungodliness and wickedness, and it's providing for your wherewithal at the same time. Don't question God's integrity when he exerts his privilege being God as a righteous and a holy God and justly punishes those who are deserving of being punished. Plain and simple. They deserve. So you could say, and I've said this before, and I just made it up, but it seemed to me like it was pretty obvious. This amounted to killing two birds with one stone. Not in a negative type of way, but here the promised land was given, which is good, and the heathen were eradicated, and that's good. And it all came about through the exploits and the leadership of Joshua under the guidance of God in taking the land of Canaan. So two things were accomplished all at the same time by God. Whether he was intended that I would recognize that or not, I don't know. But it certainly seems obvious to me. There are about 25 years that are covered in the book of Joshua. And so anytime that you take a prominent figure like a Moses out of the equation, then there's all types of opportunities for bad stuff to happen. An idle mind can result in a whole lot of bad things coming. And so that's why they need the successor, and that's what they got. That's what they got. And so some of the things that you would think just naturally would flow out of this, if you're having to have a person now in charge, do you think the children of Israel, even this purified generation, or this generation that did not die in the wilderness, but had simply been a witness to the destruction of the older people because of their rebellion and their murmuring against God, do you think that there still might be the possibility that while they show allegiance to Moses and are doing the right thing, when Moses is gone, that would be a testing time for sure? Because here people, I mean, just think about when you got your teachers. Now, this is the way it used to be. I don't know the way it is now. But you got your teacher at school And then lo and behold, they get sick and don't come in, and here is a substitute teacher. Pity the poor old substitute teacher. Poor old thing. They need to be Attila the Hun. They need to come in, grab the biggest one, slam up against the wall, and say, if anybody else does anything out of order, then you're going to get mashed just like this punk here. But you can't do that, see? So they're going to be testing. They're going to see what they can get by with. Well, obviously, that's something that's going to be dealt with too, and have to be dealt with, because these people have demonstrated themselves to be likely to be disobedient. And if they follow the sad example of the parents, then they're going to continue to do that, to fail to fall in line and to do what God intends for them to do. And of course, on the part of Joshua, while he has been basically second in control all this time, he's still going to have to earn the respect of the people. He should be getting that respect by right, since he is now appointed by God to be in this position. But you know good and well, people are going to be watching him and seeing what he's doing and just looking for any slip up, so they say, oh, you're not no Moses. I guarantee that you may be our leader, but you're not a Moses. You know, you think anything like that might happen? Why, of course, it would happen. So, and of course, when you consider that on top of all that, these people that you're fixing to be fighting against have been preparing for battle for quite some time. And that's pretty obvious from the words of one Rahab, who happens to live in one of the cities that is defeated, the first one, which is Jericho. The inhabitants of the land of Canaan are well aware of how successful the armies of God have been up till this moment in time. You know, they know the exploits with the heathen nations on the east side of the Jordan River. They know all about what's happened all those times. And so you better believe that they have made special provision to be able to throw back the onslaught that they're going to face at the hands of the children of Israel at some point in the future. They don't know exactly when it's going to happen. And so you've got you've got walled cities, you've got fully functional armies, and of course it's hard for us to visualize what existed in Canaan when you have these, they call them city-states, because they are their own separate nation, but they are not anything but a city, a small nation. We think of nations today, we think of China, Russia, you know. Well, that's not the way it was in Canaan. And the limited amount of room that was in Canaan was populated by numerous different peoples who had various financial interests with each other, who traded with each other, who fought with each other. All these different things that happened with the same turmoil over boundary lines that exist today existed in the land of Canaan. So the children of Israel will have to be dealing with all them. And don't be surprised when you have some of these city-states who come to their thinking and they say, you know what, by ourselves they might just wipe us off the map, but what if we went together and fought against them? Wow. And so when that happens, you know, will the army be bigger? Sure. Would it be more powerful? Obviously so. But then you're going to have all the intrigue that goes into, well, who's going to be the leader? If you got 3 cities here and they have 3 different kings and 3 different nations, then who's going to be the most important? Well, then you got all those problems to deal with too. So all that particular specific things is what we're going to be looking at in this book, and that'll be it. Has anybody got any questions, any comments? My suggestion would be to read the text first. Like, if I would, because they're divided the way this material is put together. If you see on page number 2, there you've got Israel is prepared for conquest. for the conquest. You got 5 chapters. The easiest way to go about doing it is read those 5 chapters once, and then go back and read the specific little part that goes along with the questions, like verses 1 through 18 of chapter 1, and then you can answer your questions. And by all means, if there's something that comes up that is obscure or something that doesn't make sense to you, then don't hesitate to make a special note of that and bring it up, and we'll talk about it. Because I guarantee you, if there's something that's obscure or hard to understand, then you're not the only one that sees that. And so you'll be helping everybody else out by bringing that to our attention, and we'll deal with it. How's that sound? Okay. I heard the bell, so you got an extra 5 minutes to try to put my